Well, welcome to this seminar on Jordan Peterson, Seeking for Meaning, this November 2020. Many people know Peterson for his book, 12 Rules for Life, and his addressing the current millennial crisis of meaning. I'm Dr. Gordon Carkner, and I work with graduate students and faculty at the University of British Columbia as a sort of chaplain to inspire them, to encourage the integration of faith and studies, to open their horizons to broader thinking, and particularly like Jordan Peterson, to bring up questions of meaning and purpose and calling and direction in life. So I resonate with Peterson and his attempt to help young students and young millennials find their center, find a meaning in their life. Peterson really has the best of intentions. It's important to realize that Jordan Peterson is deeply concerned with living a meaningful life, one that conforms to core values and is part of a larger dynamic. Indeed, his primary in-depth work is called Maps of Meaning. It tells the story of how he is striving to connect the dots between our subjective lives and how he is the themes and struggles of the universe at large, the bigger picture. So he's very interested in history, he's very interested in social movements, etc. In that book, Maps of Meaning, he lays out the view that many humans throughout the centuries have represented the mythic nature of the universe through archetypal lenses of the dialectic between the feminine or chaos and the masculine order. He also finds compelling the archetypal narratives of suffering, sacrifice, and redemption, and we'll see that in the course of this talk as we unpack a little bit of why Peterson is seen as someone who really speaks to the existential identity crisis in millennials. So nihilism today among our best and brightest. Prominent Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith, in his book Souls in Transition, noted the nihilism of many university students today. He noticed a dominant theme in the 18 to 23-year-old university population. He sees them as basically soft ontological anti-realists, that there is no really real world, epistemological skeptics questioning everything, perspectivalists, mine is the only one of many ways to see this situation, constructivists, tasked with building or inventing self and morality from the ground up, quite a monumental task, moral intuitionists, my feelings about a situation or my decision is the absolute bottom line and the key factor in everything I do and think about. So what is the attraction among millennials and younger Gen Z people to Jordan Peterson? Why are so many people buying his book, listening to his, watching his YouTube talks, etc.? And here are some of the reasons I have discerned that I see the connection where the resonance is with the young people and Jordan Peterson. Scientific or exclusive humanism really proves inadequate to our natural quest for meaning and significance. So when we're young, we're really looking for the bigger picture, understanding what is my life, what does my life mean in the bigger picture, and what is my calling in life. And a cold universe that is deaf to our pain and aspirations is not something that really inspires us that much. So being merely biological beings seems inadequate. Secondly, people are searching for psychological, spiritual, and relational insight into their brokenness. They are searching for truth about the inner self, emotions, motivations, and pain. Peterson is also willing to wrestle with some of the toughest existential or the big life questions. Who am I? Where have I come from? Where am I going? Philosophical and religious questions, social and cultural, historical questions. He thinks more deeply than many about the anthropology of evil and the power of the lie or the big lie, how the lie can actually destroy a person's life. You might also see Jason Stanley, a professor who talks about the idea of how cultures can get tied in with a lie. Many are drawn to his fatherly advice to cultivate their inner life, grow in character, honor, and respect. He offers practical wisdom, what's called in philosophy phronesis. Further attraction comes from these items. His promise that a mature meaning can help us survive the crucible of suffering. It's a kind of what you would call tragic optimism. This is the optimism of Viktor Frankl, who went through the Dachau concentration camp in the Second World War. He's the father of logotherapy and positive psychology. And I guess you could say that Peterson fits within that school of positive psychology, psychology of meaning, so to speak. There are practical suggestions in Peterson about realignment, coming to grips with my own personal chaos, nihilism, resentment, and lack of direction. So the young millennial might say, okay, Jordan, you're right, you've got me. I need to grow up. I'm almost 30 and still living over my parents' garage. So we all need courage to look into the abyss, face our shadow, our dark side, as Jung would say, and our draw towards malevolence, towards evil. Peterson is very much a Jungian psychologist. He's very heavily invested in Carl Jung and his ideas. Peterson resonates in the age of anatheism. This is written large by Richard Kearney from Boston College, Discovering God After God, so to speak, the idea of the search in today's world for meaning, even with the culture being largely committed to nihilism or the loss of meaning, because it's just a material world. The key concept here is the openness to epiphany. For some male millennials, Peterson actually, at the end of the day, becomes a gateway drug to Christianity. Many have watched him teach these Bible videos on YouTube and been attracted to look into the Bible for themselves and begin to find a Christian group or a group of people to talk to about the Bible and find deep, deep meaning in that. Also, Peterson recognizes an order of being that we must respect, which is attractive to religious and non-religious alike. So you don't have to have a particular worldview to enjoy Jordan Peterson. He can attract people from a variety of backgrounds and from different religions. So what he does is he intrigues without forcing them into a particular worldview. I think that's helpful, that he sets himself up as a dialogue partner, and he's very good at that. He's very good at dialogue with other people and with young millennials in particular. If you wanted to see a quote that sort of parallels our own age, this quote from the introduction of The Tale of Two Cities is that kind of statement from Charles Dickens. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we're all going direct the other way. I think what I've discerned in my philosophical analysis of Jordan Peterson is that he has isolated something at the center of the four major culture spheres, that the thing that could really draw us back together is looking at how suffering and tragedy can reconnect the religious, the ethical, the aesthetic, and the scientific. I found really great help on understanding this idea of culture spheres by Calvin Schrag in his book, The Self After Postmodernity. He was very helpful during my PhD research on this particular issue. So here's a quote from Peterson about the nexus, how suffering and tragedy is the nexus or the existential starting point for many people in search of meaning. If your life is stuck and you want to get on with it, sometimes you have to reckon with your own suffering and the suffering around you, just like the Buddha had to reckon with the suffering outside of the palace. What can I doubt? What can I not doubt? The reality of suffering. It brooks no arguments. Nihilists cannot undermine it with skepticism. Totalitarians cannot banish it. Cynics cannot escape from its reality. Suffering is real, and the artful infliction of suffering on another for its own sake is wrong. That became the cornerstone of my belief. So you can really see this throughout the writing and the speaking of Peterson. He'll often come back to that. That's his jugular vein, so to speak, when he's trying to argue his worldview with people. So here's a sense, pain can be a source of revelation. You know, that sense that we cannot go on like this. You know, we've got to fix this relationship, or we've got to deal with our existential angst or condition of suffering. And as I've said, suffering can be the link between the religious, the ethical, the scientific, and the aesthetic. Therefore, we're meant to suffer well towards the good. It marshals all our resources and pulls us together at an integral level. His insight on this is really deep and quite profound, I must say. I really appreciate what he's done on dealing with that existential concern of suffering. So in that sense, he recognizes that we need all the culture spheres to address the question of suffering, not just medicine, but we need the poetry, we need the arts and humanities and theology. So he's very much open to the idea of the full linguistic capacity to deal with suffering and tragedy. And he's an extremely articulate individual. He's very well-read, extremely well-read. He's really a champion of the great books and that sort of thing. So let's just go for a moment into let's try to do a little bit of mapping of the existential crisis that millennials are facing and see why Peterson is connecting with them. First is the lack of grounding. Many of them are raised on moral subjectivism and radical tolerance. On one hand, in contrast or contradiction with political correctness. You can see this in the foreword of his book, 12 Rules for Life. I also see this kind of thing in Icarus Fallen by Chantal Del Sol. So many students are actually going through a conflicted education and mentoring process. So they actually have these paradoxes or outright conflicts of ideology at work in them, which causes confusion and internal dissonance. Secondly, there's a lack of meaningful story to make sense of life. A lot of people are suffering from cultural amnesia, biblical illiteracy, the loss of the great story. So many are looking for a story to make sense of their life. I met a young professor, Dr. Alistair Smith from University of Toronto, the OISE School, who uses Shakespeare as a way to connect with millennials as well. He's worked a lot with inner city youth in London, New York, and Toronto, and very much sees the power of story, of having those young people articulate, rewrite a Shakespeare play, act it out, and many of them have been motivated to go on to university. Otherwise, they would have been lost in society, in drug addiction, etc. There is also something that Peterson is very sympathetic with, and that is the wounded masculine soul, which is very much an issue today. There's a lot of self-doubt, relational issues combined with lack of realism and self-discipline. Suicide rates among young males is quite frightening these days. So there's obviously some problems there. And he seems to be appealing to young males in particular, but lots of women are interested in him as well. The other thing is that many people today are addicted to technology and easy access entertainment. Life is free, quick, and opioid-like. So this movie, Netflix movie called The Social Dilemma, articulates this as best as anything I've seen this year or in recent years. It creates a kind of addiction and attention deficit syndrome in young people. Nihilism is sometimes caused by scientism, the belief that science is everything, about radical individualism, late capitalist hyper-consumerism. So as we said, Notre Dame's Christian Smith pointed out these different characteristics of nihilism in university students today. And he calls it a soft nihilism, but it's a nihilism nevertheless. Then Matthew Crawford, in his book, The World Beyond Your Head, actually points out another thing that's really affecting millennials today, quite challenging for them. It's called performance anxiety at work. It derives from the lack of a strong moral identity and good moral interlocutors. So then if a person doesn't have a good sense of their own morality, and I think that's very weak in our culture, in our Western culture today, corporations and their bottom line swoops in to fill that vacuum and shapes one's whole identity and purpose. So your whole worth, your whole value is measured by your quantitative performance, not your character. Of course, you have to get along with your fellow employees, but it's just about the amount of product you become a work product. You be reduced to a work product, and that can create a sense of nihilism. So in summary, what we're seeing in many people today, many young people today, is disorientation, uncertainty, self-loathing within this crisis of affirmation, cynicism, anger, and resentment, skyrocketing depression, and yet at the same time a longing for purpose, meaningful impact, challenge, and even heroism. So it's this that really lays the groundwork for Jordan Peterson's rise, I suppose you could say, beyond his classroom as a professor to having an impact on the culture. So where we can go with Peterson is that he really focuses on the primacy of the individual. The individual is the epicenter of his solution to the problem of nihilism. It's not the selfish, entitled, narcissistic individual who is indifferent to social demands and the common good. It's not the corrupt, toxic individual who is a danger to self and society, easily manipulated, lured by tribalism or ideology. It's the high goal, focused person who can endure suffering with meaning intact. And this was all part of the genius of Peterson was what he called the self-authoring suite, which helped students get motivated by really going back in their life and tracing their history, finding out what went wrong, where the pain is, and then beginning to plan their future. And apparently he has moved the curve in terms of number of students who drop out from university when he taught at Harvard University and at University of Toronto. So more about the primacy of the individual. It's the alert, honest, courageous, articulate, and responsible individual. This is the hope for society. So Peterson keeps telling us to pay attention, wake up to reality, be intelligent, articulate, develop your language, be reasonable, examine your axioms and your assumptions. That means, be humble in your academic work. Be responsible, which involves sacrifice for other people. So we could also look in comparison at Bernard Lonergan. He's a famous philosopher. Bernard Lonergan's key markers of self-transcendence. They're along the same line. It's an individualism that is engaged with and committed to a natural and moral reality. It's a kind of critical realism and moral realism mixed. He believes in a kind of Tao of some sort, a kind of moral fabric that's in society, and it's something we need to pay attention to. It's, I guess you could say, an intercultural moral heritage, because he's willing to draw on various cultures. So he's very pluralistic. He's willing to draw on various cultures around the world. He sees this human search for morality, meaning, and identity in all cultures. And I guess his strength is that he's able to bring those touchstones to light. So it's the individual who's committed to telling the truth and aspiring to the good. This is rule 7 and 8. Authenticity is key for him. You're willing to bear the burden of your own being. We can think of a heroic young lady like Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani girl who was shot and survived a bullet to the head, and became an inspiring speaker, became a heroic individual through her tragic experience. So she would be a person who experienced that tragic suffering and came out strong on the other side. So I guess, I don't know if he's mentioned her, but she's definitely fits the bill of the Jordan Peterson recovery. It's a kind of stoic virtues that he offers, a courage, self-management, prudence, and justice. Peterson, his self-dependent method for recovery, a moral agency, is really a good start, if not sufficient, as we'll really question whether he's got the final answer, but I think he's getting people started in a way that others are not. So it's important for me, drawing on Søren Kierkegaard, the Dutch philosopher, or the Danish philosopher, to see the different levels of meaning, the religious, the ethical, and the aesthetic. These are Kierkegaard's 3 stages of development. And Peterson basically moves us from the aesthetic to the ethical. Peterson's project is largely working at the level of the ethical, bringing the hedonic, lazy, indulgent aesthete into the ethical stage of development. So he's telling us to choose meaning rather than expedience, rule number 7. Involves responsible self-care, rule number 2. Listening to the other, rule number 9. Good citizenship, whether it's Stoicism, the English gentleman, or Confucianism. We can make or discover meaning by reducing suffering. This fits with David Brooks' book, The Second Mountain. Once we have realigned the bitter, aimless self to the good and start telling the truth and living the truth. Calvin Schrag is a philosopher we mentioned already. He calls this a weak form of transcendence. It's a positive term, but it's at the horizontal level of growth and development. Now, if we compare this in dialogue with Charles Taylor, who's one of my favorite philosophers, a Canadian philosopher from McGill University, we compare the solution on identity from Charles Taylor versus, or along with, in dialogue with, I guess, Jordan Peterson, we would say that Taylor engages Peterson by going a step further, wagering on a transcendent turn to agape love, or what's called a strong form of transcendence. He brings the aesthete through the ethical and into the religious, the direction of freedom and interdependence with radical alterity. Trying to explain that. a lot of words there. So if we were to kind of channel Charles Taylor in dialogue with Jordan Peterson, we would say, let's leverage Peterson by resolving his moral agency upward. Let's move beyond the ethical to the religious. This move pushes him into a larger moral horizon, a larger social imaginary, to use a famous Taylor term. He may feel a bit uncomfortable with strong transcendence, but ultimately offers a more robust form of moral agency, a stronger form of resilience. Both of these men have a hierarchy of values and a hypergood. Peterson holds personal sacrifice, not particularly happiness, not impressed with happiness, as the highest controlling good. Taylor sees the ultimate good in agape love. And if you want a very articulate statement on the impact of agape love in moving us from the ancient world to today, Larry Siedentop's book, Inventing the Individual, is very helpful. So what are, at the end of the day, what are the sources of the moral self? If we see the moral self in dialogue with identity and meaning, we see it well, I think. Peterson, an existential humanist, sees the sources of the good as largely within the self-dependent individual, choosing, acting, creating meaning, inventing self, self-expressiveness, even in the face of nihilism, brokenness, and despair. He's a kind of bootstrap type of guy. You fight chaos and build some order through setting noble goals. it has an ironic kind of resonance with Foucault's concept of reinventing the self. He also suggests consulting mythopoetic stories to assist one's self-understanding. This includes the great biblical stories as well as Disney. The question we are asking is whether does he not implode the religious into the ethical, to look back at this Kierkegaard's 3 stages of development. And that's maybe our critique of Peterson, that he doesn't go far enough. Taylor believes that an understanding of strong transcendence is crucial to our best and most robust account of the moral world. My contention is that Peterson's resistance to strong transcendence is a choice to constrict the moral horizon and thereby the moral imagination. It entails a refusal of epiphany and a weak understanding of grace. But many are searching for transcendence in this age of anatheism after God. It is a decision that Peterson makes, and it has consequences. For him, Peterson takes an existential leap of faith. Faith is the realization that the tragic irrationalities of life must be countered by an equally irrational commitment to the essential goodness of being. But he shies away from engagement with the goodness of a real personal God. Is, at the end of the day, Peterson working against himself and his project of recovering moral agency and existential health? Perhaps it's not a full recovery from nihilism that we want. There are 2 different ways of seeing or understanding the world. One is called epistemological and one is called hermeneutical. I won't be able to go into them in great detail, but in a sense, Peterson spans both of those approaches. One epistemological starts with the individual. Hermeneutical starts with the environment that one is in. Peterson's phenomenological approach, his attention to actual human experience, seems to fit better the hermeneutical way of seeing, as he attempts to recover meaning and purpose, to re-enchant the world, to authenticate human subjectivity, drama, moral agency, purpose, consciousness, and conscientiousness, the deeper substantial things of personhood. Like a colossus, he tries to span the 2 ways. He respects neuroscience and evolutionary psychology as a limited discipline on the epistemological side of things, but he also tries to recover meaning and moral agency. He leans towards the hermeneutical. Science is necessary, but not sufficient for him and for our psychological well-being, for the recovery of meaning. Okay, here's some suggested reading along the lines of what we've been talking about, and I'll let you have a look at that. And then this is a book I've written called The Great Escape from Nihilism, Rediscovering Our Passion in Late Modernity. And I'll just wrap up with letting you have a look at that bibliography a little bit longer. And of course, you can stop the video. So thanks very much for joining us on this journey with Jordan Peterson and the existential crisis for millennials.